Welcome to Rune Soup, a podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal, coming to you from Land Down Under. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. Enjoy. Today on Rune Soup, we welcome back fellow podcaster and Gnosis nerd, Miguel Conner. If he somehow needs further introduction, Miguel is the host of Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio and the author of Voices of Gnosticism and the recently released Other Voices of Gnosticism. Miguel, how are things in the frigid dystopia?
They are frigid and they are dystopia, but I'm glad to be on Rune Soup for a little bit of warmth.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Very glad to have you back. And we are talking because you have a new book out. The second in your Voices of Gnosticism possible series.
Indeed. It was time to, after the first book came out in 2010, late 2010, I believe. So it was time to get on those transcripts and get to the next round. I guess the difference is the first book, Voices of Gnosticism, really focused on the classic Gnostics, 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, the Nag Hammadi library Gnostics, and it was transcripts with some of the founder or the original translators of the Nag Hammadi library, plus some of the great scholars in Gnostic studies like Karen King, Elaine Pagels, Bart Ehrman was on there. This one, we wanted to sort of start spreading out and going down through history. And of course, we have great scholars too. Some of the scholars included in this new book are mutual, hero, Gary Lockman.
Yep.
Includes Robert Price, Sean Martin. Who else? A whole bunch of Tobias Churton, a whole bunch of scholars. Some are academics, some are researchers. And we went further into time to sort of, start spreading the Gnostic knowledge throughout history, going a little sideways to the Hermetics, the Mandeans, going down into time with the Cathars. We start in this book, Other Voices of Gnosticism, by the way. We start hitting on some of the Gnostic luminaries like Carl Jung, Philip K. Dick, John the Baptist, Paul of Tarsus, Simon Magus, and others. So I think this is a good second book.
Yeah, it works quite sequentially, and for a couple of reasons. So I do this weekly video Q&A as part of my newsletter, and I've had a couple of questions to do with essentially for a beginner, how does one get their heads around that sort of exotic soup that was the first couple of centuries in the Eastern Mediterranean? And I thought about it in preparation for the video Q&A, and I'm like, basically the answer is spend 30 minutes on Wikipedia getting the terms right, and then if you get Voices of Gnosticism and Other Voices of Gnosticism, that gives you really good insights into the kind of cutting edge of what people are thinking and talking about and researching in this field. And for me, it's quite good because people can then deep dive in. I got a question about Simon Magus, and I'm actually going to ask you about that as well. And you get the sort of overview, and then you have the opportunity of going back and listening to other episodes of your show, or you have the opportunity of going out and getting these researchers' books. And it's something that's quite remarkable because it's a very challenging and messy subject. And also, for something that's 2,000 years old, if the first book came out in 2010, quite a lot has happened in kind of patristics and early Christian research in the last, fully 6 years now. So it was definitely time to return to the Eastern Med in a way.
Indeed it was. I mean, a lot, I think, has changed. And what I tell people is people have spent hundreds of years trying to figure out the New Testament and the Old Testament. The first English translation that the public could have was in 1979. So we're still very much at the baby steps of it. And again, a lot has changed. I think when the first book came out, the term Gnosticism was sort of out of vogue. And now they were considered alternative Christians. But there's definitely been a pushback in both academia and research to say, no, the term Gnosticism actually does work. And even if you think it does work and there's an argument it doesn't work, it's really the term we should just stay with because it's in a way it's useful. It's kind of like the argument, well, Gnosticism was created in the 17th century by a Christian theologian. It's an umbrella term. And of course, the argument is, well, so was Buddhism. So was Hinduism. I mean, these terms, they do work to an extent. So I'm glad to see that Gnosticism is sort of staying. Plus, there was the attitude that the Gnostics were sort of these nice, humble, liberal Christians who were just kind of writing their own views of things. Now the pendulum is swinging a little bit to the original form, which the Gnostics were these sort of hardcore punk rebels who really were standing up to society. They were anarchists and geeks. So now, again, it's nice to see that things are sort of swinging back. And again, this is being backed up in academia and by researchers.
Yeah, and the sort of the makeup of academia and the researchers has shifted, and in a good way, because Gnostic research does have its origins in biblical scholarship, obviously, which comes with its own, and Bart Ehrman is a very good example of this, I think. It comes with its own sort of blinkers when it comes to what's real and what's not and what probably happened. And we've seen, and this is, I think, a big difference between 2010 and 2016, we've seen more interdisciplinary research happen, kind of bringing in the awareness of the Egyptian influence and the Greek influence and the fact that it is a polyglot. And so you start to have you have linguists and philologists doing Egyptological research. And I guess the other big thing that's kind of happened is the rise to prominence of mythicism, which has really reinvigorated examination of these texts and kind of changed how we could put them in sequence and sort of see if that works, see if we can get the electricity to run through it with this new way of looking at the texts and how they sat in the cultures at the time.
Yeah, I would agree, but there's still a bit of resistance. It's almost like many scholars still don't want to face the Gnostics. The argument, again, is the dating, and that we don't know what the dating is, so we can't relate it to Egypt or we can't relate it to Zoroastrianism and all that. And I think that's unfortunate, but there are scholars who are, again, standing their ground. For example, April DeConnick's new book, The Gnostic New Age, I highly recommend it. That's one of those books that comes out in Gnostic studies maybe every 5 to 10 years that really summarizes and break things too. And April DeConnick works with Jeff Kripal down at Rice. So down at Rice University, they definitely have a very, they like to take risks, and like you were talking about, they've gone beyond to tying everything in and really giving us a good zeitgeist of what the Gnostics were doing 2,000 years ago and their influence throughout history.
Yeah, so, I mean, that's a good question to ask. It'll be one of the first ones. Do you think the sort of John Turner Gnostics began in the 2nd century thing is correct? Because I don't think that, depending on what you consider to be the DNA of Gnosticism, I don't think that's fair. I think you can find its grandparents in Middle Kingdom Egypt, but I'm not sure if that. I think that's a narrow definition. There was certainly a lot going on in the 2nd century, but I think you're dealing with something that's, if only a little bit, but is pre-Christian. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think John Turner does posit that there are layers in sort of the Secret Book of John and others that show an older form of Gnosticism, pre-Christian Jewish Gnosticism. But beyond that, I would agree. First, I would agree that this idea of some sort of ground zero, or that it came from Christianity or Judaism, that's probably a red herring. And that's an argument that Dylan Burns has brought back. He's a scholar in Germany. And in his book, The Apocalypse of the Alien God. And he basically, and I think other scholars, you can read Margaret Barker's The Great Angel and so forth, that makes a good argument that Judaism was there was never a formative Judaism. It was always a fluid thing. Jews were polytheistic, even in the 1st century, probably beyond. There was never an agreement. So the best argument is that there was what you might call a Judo-Christian super stew that has been going around from BC times. I mean, as Richard Carrier said, the idea of a spiritual Messiah was in Judaism even before the times of Jesus. And you can see it in such texts as the Ascension of Isaiah. So what happens is that saying when Gnosticism came out is not the right question. I think like what April de Connet argues in her book, The Gnostic New Age, Gnosticism is more of a metaphysical orientation more than a movement. It was something that's always been in the air and always will be in the air. As she breaks it down, there's 4 types of religion. There's the obedience religion, where there's the gods, I do what the gods say. There's a second time, the covenant religion. Hey, I'm going to make a deal with the God, maybe sacrifice to this God. He'll take care of the tribe or the nation. There's the third type, which is more called, you might say, the mystic shamanistic type. I'm going to commune with this God, connect with this God, gain an experience with this God, but the God is still in charge. The Gnostic orientation was very unique because it was about an experience. It was shamanistic to make a connection with a God. But the thing is that it went beyond the gods of this world, all the spirits, all the demons and angels, to connect with this sort of primal source, this hitherto unknown God that was more of the font of information, the font of existence, that was separate and distant from this planet. And this was very unique. And you do see, again, this sort of sensibility before the times of Christians. You can read books like the Odes of Solomon, and they're already talking about a connection with God. You can even see it in the letters of Paul. Paul thinks that Yahweh is an unknown God that the Jews and the Gentiles did not know, that it's beyond this world. And he had to basically send his angel to spread gnosis to the world. Yeah. So this idea it's always been in the air. It's only in the 2nd century that all these different movements in Alexandria, Rome, Asia Minor start to coagulate and start to create, again, these different movements, which we would call the Gnostics.
And this is a bit of a leading question, because I agree completely, and I like the metaphysical orientation description of it, because one of the things that I talk about in the Q&A with the newsletter and so on is there was, in a funny way, it was kind of like different scientific disciplines operating in a worldview. There was clearly an Eastern Mediterranean worldview that allowed theurgy and Hermeticism and Gnosticism and people to discuss and explore. This was the science of the day, with a sort of broad consensus across Platonists and Gnostics and diaspora Jews about the general structure of the universe. And then they can kind of go, well, is it a demiurge model? Is it this? Is it an emanatory model? And that, I think, is what a lot of people in contemporary esoterica miss in something like a quote-unquote rejection of Christianity. It's pagan. Like, it's 1/3 Greek, it's 1/3 Near Eastern, it's 1/3 Egyptian. And if you don't kind of swim in these waters and try and work out what the Gnostics were talking about, and you kind of miss what was actually going on. And so I guess my leading question, which I don't need anymore, was what is the value of upskilling or learning about these groups and texts? But I think it's that it allows us, we get to metaphysically orient in 2016 once we kind of get a better view of the soup.
Oh, I would agree. I mean, what did both Tessa Dick and Michael Moorcock say? We live in a Philip K. Dick world. I think even Chris Knowles says these times are very Gnostic. Times are more like you almost need gnosis to survive these very strange times. And that's what they were talking about 2,000 years ago. Yes, I think you nailed them how they were. But again, this is a metaphysical orientation where you simply stand back and you say this world is an illusion, all the gods and their servants are really deficient or lower, they've had their use, it's time we take these, it's time we go to the stars, it's time we go beyond the stars in these flights, and it's time we make contact with, as Dylan Burns call it, the alien god, and bring back whatever information he has, and let's see what he does. And of course, how bad you want to see the world or how good and all that, the question is about going home beyond the stars, as you might say it. And the Gnostic propensity for distrusting reality, I think, is very useful today. Like I like to tell people in my show, I tell them, don't try to save the world. Save your sanity first. If you can save your sanity in these times, like the Gnostics were doing 2,000 years ago, because Carl Jung did call him the first depth psychologist, because they really wanted to break down the mind and go deep within and find out what was false within us and what was true, what was programmed, and so forth, and figure out this kind of West world that we live in. So I see my book and I see the Gnostic voice 2,000 years as very useful for our times, and we can get going and like that fundamentalists do. You know, we live like in the Roman Empire, but I would say that when you look at the atmosphere in the Roman Empire in the 2nd century, it's pretty eerily close to what we are today with the American Empire. I mean, you and I have talked about it, the decline of the empire and how things are shifting, and reality doesn't seem to make sense. There's a huge sense of distrust, huge sense of fragmentation within countries. It's just, it's pretty weird.
It couldn't be, and as mutual friend Chris Knowles has on a few recent posts on his blog, The Secret Sun, there are even accidental imperial motifs around the incoming ginger demiurge, and that's weird.
Yes. That's Trump the emperor.
Yeah, that's really weird. And it seems unlikely that a lot of that was programmed. It just seems to be that, well, look what reality's doing. It's just making it very obvious that you're in a kind of policeman said hologram.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you wonder, was Philip K. Dick, was his fiction a prophecy, or was he simply starting to lift a veil? Because as you start looking down into history, you realize this sort of like you said, veil, this hologram probably has been there. Somehow we've woken up in this century, late this century, and it's kind of like we're coming out of Plato's cave, and people are seeing reality, and they're just getting very dizzy, very distorted. And the question is, will the archons just well, what are they going to do? They're going to find a way to try to keep us asleep. It seems if we're finding information as humans, they're just going to bury us in misinformation. And I know you've been writing a lot about that. And now we live in a time where we don't even know what news is, or people are trying to tell us what news is and what fake news is. So yes, these are definitely very interesting times. And I don't know what else can I say. I mean, I could say Pizzagate and our ratings would go up.
Well,
that's about it.
What I find interesting, so one of the things I learned from this book, which I thought was quite useful to ponder for kind of extracting best practice for us today, for instance, is I didn't realize that in some of the Gnostic, or particularly, I guess, Sethian sort of views, that there is an apocalypse baked into waking up. So in the model where the fragments of the true God have fallen and become trapped in this system, the more of them that wake up and return to source, it means that the sort of broken true God becomes more and more complete, and it will get to a tipping point where the universe will collapse. So that the Gnostics, some branches of Gnosticism, were actively trying to wake themselves and others up to destroy the universe. And that, for some reason, really appeals to me.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about the Gnostics, or why I found them attractive. They really were playing for keeps in anything they did. Yes, apocalypse is very important in a lot of the works. In fact, I think Karen King even argues that the Gnostics were the first ones to really put a history of salvation. They wanted to start from before in the beginning, and they wanted to go farther into the end, until the total destruction of the universe. Some did posit a cyclical model, but I think the important part was the rescue operation, and as you say, the gathering of the light sparks, as they call it in the Kabbalah, and then watching the universe sort of implode in itself, the works of the demiurge controlling us. And yeah, sometimes when you look at the world, you might just go, maybe there is no hope. Maybe this is the only way out, you know?
Well, I think you can bring it down to a national level in this era of fake news and reality star presidents and so on. The best thing you can do is to wake up and to wake other people up. And if that happens to bring the whole thing down, then, you know, we'll build something better afterwards. And I found that really, really appealing that they were, as you say, they were playing for keeps. This was, it was big magic.
Yeah, and it's something that should be noted, despite their sort of grim outlook, again, their sort of punk rock attitude about taking on the system at any cost and going straight to the top, to the man behind the curtain, to the demiurge and his representatives. The Gnostics were actually very positive. And when you read their text, there's always a sense of, you know, there is a rescue operation. Things are going to be okay. Sophia is on our side. All we need to do is, all we really need to do is wake up. I mean, again, talking about somebody that's been on both of our radars before, I was thinking the Gnostics really do fall into Colin Wilson's positive existentialist model.
Yeah.
I mean, they do start, as Hans Jonah argues in the Gnostic religion, they were definitely existentialists. We're thrown into this world that really has no meaning. It's a dizzying effect. What we are is pretty much false. But I think what was the existentialist argument that Sartre made said that the most important thing in life was freedom. But after you find that freedom, there is no meaning to life. That's it. You find freedom in a meaningless universe. The Gnostics, of course, took it one step ahead and said, no, the most important thing in this life is for you to find freedom. But after that, it's time for you to find meaning. And I think even as Gary Lockman said, maybe in the Hermetic style, maybe there is no meaning to this mechanistic universe. So therefore, we have to give it meaning. We have to create meaning through our art, through our actions, through everything else. What's that line that I always like to quote from Terry Pratchett? I think it's Hogberries, where Death says humans have to believe in things that aren't so they can make them real. Something of that effect. I think that's the Gnostic attitude. It's that positive existentialism. And
that just smells so magical to me because it's another way of describing the hermetic completion of creation. It may be as humans are microcosmic reflections of the creator in an hermetic system, that the part that we perform to complete creation is that meaning, which I think, and I suspect a lot of the immediate boxing of Gnostics into the category of world-hating or dualism is fading. As that was certainly there with some of them, but I think it's fading because that is associated with kind of like phase 1 or phase 2, really, of Gnostic studies that was late 20th century and coming from a biblical bias, if you will.
No, I would certainly agree. And again, I think what I've learned is, again, you could file that under the red herring thing or the straw man argument, because number one, the term dualism was something that was concocted in universities around the 12th and 13th century by the intellectuals of the church. And of course, as soon as they came up with that concept, they decided they were going to level that on the Cathars. But as when it comes down to it, and this has been pointed out by Eastern scholars, every faith is dualist. I mean, as long as we have a consciousness that is subjective, we are going to live in a dualistic model, no matter what ideology or spirituality we embrace. So and as scholars have said, like David Brackey, the term dualism is just not helpful when describing really any religion. It's not a good way to finding out about the religion. So, and again, as far as the world hating, again, that depended on the Gnostic sect and what were doing. I mean, they were, of course, writing very harsh, grim mythology, which is what people did in those days to explain existentialist truths. They were just doing what the Platonists and the Hellenists were doing. I mean, myth tends to be gritty, and it tends to be savage, and it tends to be downright dark, kind of like our fiction and movies today, because it works. It gets people to wake up. But the reality is that it was all, again, about the idea, and this is, of course, the Hermetics would agree that this is not our world. Of course, the Hermetics have more positive that, yeah, this is a great place, but it's still not our home, and we need to make the voyage back. Some of the Scythian Gnostics, of course, start with more. They start with more of the stance, like, when an alcoholic, the only way an alcoholic can go into recovery is when he finally realizes that he has a huge problem, that things really are that bad, and it's time to start from that default line. It doesn't mean that the world is bad, but that's sort of the default attitude you take to really start the fight and really do the slog before you sort of fall into complacency. Let's make the best of it and all that. So the world hating, and of course I have to mention that the reality is that the pagans and the Platonists, all that, they didn't exactly have a good worldview too, because those were very grim times where 1/4 of your children died. There were animals on the road. There were storms. I mean, people really saw life as it really is, gritty and harsh and everything. I mean, Plotinus is always complaining about the Gnostics and, they hate the flesh and all that. But in some of his writings, he's talking about the same thing, that the flesh is a terrible thing, that it's going to fail us and all that. So this idea that the Gnostics were unique, and the Romans, of course, you've read the Romans' writing. They're very grim. They're very existentialist. Sometimes they're downright nihilists, because they were with nature, and they saw how hard nature played with its subjects.
Yeah, so I kind of think, especially when you're looking at a Sethians versus Hermeticists worldview, it's only a difference in emphasis to say the world is incomplete and that the world is broken. They're both looking at an unsatisfying situation, and it's a question of how loud you yell and how you frame that. As for the life-denying part, what I find interesting, if we take it to the Cathars, who were allegedly one of the more ascetic and closest to us in history Gnostic sects, at the time, in the Catholic calendar, you could basically not eat meat for most of the year. You had these big chunks of fasting. You could only have sex on certain days. Things were forbidden. Like, life was denied. That's just not just a Gnostic thing. Like, both sides were on this. I mean, the perfecti had to be vegetarian and all that kind of thing. But have you ever been to, like, Languedoc and the general Occitania area, Miguel?
No, I haven't had the chance to make it there.
If both myself and Europe survive to my retirement age, look for me there. There is no way you can be the land is hard, but there's no way you can be life-denying living in that kind of part of sort of the edge of Spain and France, by the Mediterranean and up into the mountains. It's perfect. It is just the best place to realize what is and isn't important in life, and I kind of think those are the things that people miss, and also obviously became very dangerous because it's a popular idea. But you just have to sort of really look at some of the myths associated with the Gnostics, and many of them don't pass the sniff test, and that's my favorite one. No one is life denying in Occitania. It's impossible.
Yeah, and you just have to see the effects they had. Yeah, one thing again is the myths they used, but the reality is even the Manichaeans and the Cathars, they were beloved by the population. They rubbed shoulders with Catholics. They certainly, some of them, of course, rubbed shoulders with the Knights Templar and so forth. But they were seen as very kind people, very intelligent people, very artistic people. And again, it's not like when they went, people were going, "Oh my God, these guys are here again!" Like the negative uncle at the dinner table or something like that. They were embraced by the
missionaries at the airport, giving you like some shitty books about, some flyover Protestantism. You go, you. It's not them. This is when someone nice shows up instead.
Right. I mean, they had all throughout history, the Gnostics had a very positive effect, and this includes the Cathars on the population. So whatever they were talking, their walk definitely had a good effect. But again, these ideas were threatening to the secular and religious powers of the time. I mean, even Platonius again argues he's pissed off at the Gnostics in his university because they're talking about these things that completely defy Platonism and throw Platonism on his back. Ideas like you can actually change the heavens and manipulate angels and gain these powers, that the chain of being is broken and so forth. And he's also angry because the Sethians at his university are going, the Romans need to give more money to the poor and for social causes and all that. And Plotinus, of course, because he was so well paid by a lot of the powers, is getting angry at them, said, if you don't like the Roman Empire, get out of here. But they were still at his university. So to make it to his university, they had to be very intelligent and very good citizens.
All right. So let's go back to the soup. What, Miguel, is the horse race model of Christianity?
The horse race model, that assumes that as soon as Jesus gave his last breath or came back from the dead or rose to heaven, all these Christianities were just off to the races, off down into the centuries, presumably to go into the grace of the Roman Empire. And that the Orthodox Christianity that would later become the Roman Catholic Christianity won the race. And of course, you can balance this out with the other model that as soon as Jesus ascended to heaven, he had his apostles, the church was founded, organized well. The apostles went around converting people, including Paul. And as the generations came, some of the Christians got a little bit naughty, started having their weird ideas about Yaldabaoth and other things, and they broke away later on in the 2nd century and would become the Gnostics and the other Christian sectarian. So again, these are two models that scholars have used for generations. But again, they are faulty models, because as I go back, there was this Judeo-Christian stew that's always been forming in a state of hybridity, and the Gnostics were basically just simply part of this stew that was going around. I mean, people don't maybe sometimes forget, but the idea of gnosis was in the air, and it was accepted by the church even in the late 2nd century, 3rd century. I mean, it was Clement of Alexandria who used to say that the true Christian has gnosis. Even Irenaeus himself, the great foe of the Gnostics, he once said, God became man so that man may become God. So this idea of finding this divine knowledge to transform yourself into a divine being was out there in the church. It was being shared through all the Christians and the Gnostics and the Orthodox. But again, as you're trying to create a franchise or make it into a corporation, some of these ideas just they weren't going to work.
Yeah, I think a modified horse race model is kind of what's in play. It seems more like a reality show, like The Amazing Race or something instead. But the general idea is what people, I think, need to get their head around at a 10,000-foot view is that you have different ideas and also different groups of people, and they move sometimes together and sometimes independently. So one of them is the kind of the debate over whether faith alone is enough or if you need some form of theurgy, and you find those ideas in these different early Christianities. Some of them swap, some of them get banned, some of them get kicked out of different areas, and that kind of model of it moving around rather than, which is what it's replaced, as you mentioned, the idea that there was some kind of, it relies on the idea that the Bible is an accurate description of someone who lives, that there was that kind of straight Jesus to Peter to Rome, and then eventually people fell away from that, which is not correct. And I think this is the bit that is very useful. And here's the question then. So a modified horse race model, right? Does that allow us to... does that bring us to the door of the Caesar's Messiah hypothesis, like in a way that means it doesn't have to explain everything?
I guess it could. I mean, For example, I always liked when I used to talk to Cheria. She always thought that there was a secret brotherhood, these very intelligent people that were going around. I mean, I don't know how secret, because you could put Philo of Alexandria there. He's definitely a big architect of both Christianity and Judaism. And these power brokers were sort of influencing a lot of these religions, and there was an experiment. I mean, again, it ties into today and the idea of deep state and creating the hippies and creating InfoWars, and who knows what they're pulling, what experiments and entheogens and all that. Acheria and others, and obviously Joe Atwell, would agree that this power brokers have always been there creating the things. Of course, Joe Atwell did tell me, because when I asked him, well, who were the Gnostics? And he said, no, they were the one group that stood up to this, to these machinations of this brotherhood, these power elite. They're always manipulating religions, and of course, they got their asses handed to them for that, because they stood up to the deep state of the time. So, in a way, his the Caesar's Messiah, I don't know if I buy into the whole theory. I mean, it's obviously that the ideas of imperial Rome did make it to a lot of religions, because because basically it's good marketing. But as far as a whole cloth, I'm not so sure. But again, this idea of this elite always manipulating religions, and religions simply being experiments of their whims, like we've seen today, I think has a lot of merit.
Well, yeah, that's kind of where I was hoping the conversation would go. I don't think it works as a singular explanation, but what Joe Atwell's done, and I think admirably, is show the matches between, say, Jesus's ministry and, imperial behavior in the Holy Land, to the point that these things are clearly falsified marketing for imperial purposes. But that's not the whole story. What we were just discussing was, at the time, in that corner of the world, you have this proto-Judeo-Egypto-Greco God and collection of philosophies. This is the sort of area or topology that the imperial marketing worked on. And I think a modified horse race model really helps for that, because between 2010 and 2016, one of the big kind of, independent research things that's happened, or at least received cut through, it was a slightly earlier idea, is this Caesar's Messiah hypothesis, which is a lot of and it kind of problematizes Josephus and all the sort of stuff that those who are non-mythicist biblical scholars rely on. So it's been quite a good king hit, and there are some very interesting data points. I don't think Caesar's Messiah is necessary to explain everything, and I don't think it does. But this is an exciting 2016 thing. We now have a framework to examine what these machinations would look like within the kind of crazy multiple Christianities culture of the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. There was definitely a lot of experiments. I mean, obviously, Josephus is extremely important to the creation of Christianity. And obviously, Josephus was working under the Roman coin when he was writing all these stories. So that seems to be very interesting. I mean, there's a lot of arguments against the Caesar Messiah thesis. I mean, my argument is that it didn't work out so well because you quell the Jews, but in the middle of the 2nd century, you had the Bar Kokhba revolt, where the Jews came back even stronger. They were even to throw the Romans out of there, and it had to be, I think it was Hadrian who had to bring out his full might down there and finally kick out all the Jews from Palestine. He had to destroy Jerusalem and create a pagan city and all that. So, but I think there's no doubt, as we both know, that deep state has always been at work. The archons have always been at work, probably since the beginning of time.
Yeah, and Josephus wasn't just receiving Roman coin, though, was he? He was an adopted member of the actual imperial royal family. So you sort of bring your Eddie Bernays PR guy into the family and say, write the history of Christianity. Something smells there,
Something did smell, and there's so much. Yeah, there's so much that was probably uncovered or covered that we really don't know. Again, the idea that we have to look for a ground zero is an erroneous way of looking at it. Once you get rid of this started in this day and this came out of this way, once you get out that thinking, that's when things become a lot clearer.
I think that works, and funnily enough, that's the value of Gnosticism, because if you look at what the quote-unquote Western tradition is comprised of, you picture it like the amulet in Mysterious Cities of Gold, where you have to put all the pieces together and it opens the door. You have Gnosticism, you have Hermeticism / astrology, you have the sort of impact of Greece and the Near East, and you end up with a flow model, and you realize, Yahweh itself, the 10 Commandments of the Hammurabi Code, Yahweh predates this and is obviously a minor Near Eastern deity that was elevated, and it plugs it all the way back into Sumer, and you don't have to do this. Someone somewhere in Antioch invented this thing, and off we go. That's that kind of really 19th century historical model isn't applicable anywhere.
Yeah, the
especially
linear model.
Here. Yeah. So actually,
the sort of the Darwinism.
Yes, that's precisely what it is. Here's a word you use a lot, Miguel. Speaking of words, heresy. What does heresy originally mean?
Heresy comes from the Greek to make a choice, and it was not a, you might say, pejorative term at the beginning. I think Josephus, it really, in the context, it meant school of thought. I mean, Josephus writes the Pharisees were a heresy of Judaism, or surgeons were a heresy of medical doctors. And this was the term, and it was, of course, but later on, this term got weaponized towards the 2nd century. Irenaeus started using it in sort of a negative context, in the context of, again, choice away from the normal. And again, it wasn't a negative term. It was a subsection of something you did. And again, it took on more or less negative connotations, and the term orthodoxy, which was straight thinking, sticking to the party line, that became sort of the cool term. But the heresy itself was never supposed to be a bad term. But of course, it's something that I proudly wear. When I talk about myself, I never say or no longer say I'm Gnostic, because I don't have that lineage. I haven't married a Mandean. I don't know any Yazidis. I don't. There's no secret organization. I mean, I of course embrace the Gnostic philosophy, so I'd rather just call myself a heretic like the Gnostics did, or like the Gnostics were called. And of course, very few of the Gnostics even call themselves Gnostics. We might have 2 instances. We have the Essenes, who used to call themselves Gnostics, and you have this enchantress called Marcellina in the 2nd century, who Irenaeus hated because she was going around Rome and seducing people. She called herself a Gnostic, but I think she was a Carpocratian. So again, I'd rather be a heretic and be done with that.
Well, Gnostic is, as we kind of mentioned, it's a word that people used within different heresies or different groups in this modified horse race, because you could describe yourself as a Gnostic if you had a transformative mystical experience within whatever heresy that you were in. And I like the idea that heresy can be, it's almost like the bad words we've used for African Americans, for gays, and so on. There's an opportunity of, I mean, it took 1800 years, but there's an opportunity to reclaim a word that has been used at us for us, because it originally meant school of thought. So in economics, you could have said, I am a Austrian heretic or a Keynesian heretic, because it's a school of thought as a subsection of economics. And I find that idea for a metaphysical audience really interesting, because the word heresy and heretic has accumulated a lot of drama in the intervening 1800 years. But there's something useful about shining a light on its etymology and sort of seeing that it was sort of pinpointing where the hijack was, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. You can start again towards the 2nd century. And it's very interesting because, as Arthur Versluis, and I'm going to put up blog posts soon, he wrote in his book, The New Inquisition, the first ideas, or the first seeds, or you might say the first machinery for thought control, really came with Irenaeus and Tertullian and those guys. Because let's face it, in ancient times, it really, what your religion was or what you thought really wasn't that important. Did you pay taxes? Were you subservient to the imperial power around you? It was really your actions that worked, for the most part. But Irenaeus and Tertullian, in their paranoia, they started talking about no, because they were just so afraid that all these Gnostics were in their churches, because the Gnostics were pretty secretive, and or at least in their rituals when we're not in church. So these are the church fathers started thinking of ways to, you might say, punish thought. What you thought was a crime. It didn't matter if you were a Christian and what your actions were as a good Christian, but if you thought that maybe there was a God above God or something like that, you had to be taken out and punished. And this sort of thought police really started to develop, and Arthur Vesluis argues very well. In fact, it got fully weaponized in the medieval times. As most people don't know, the Inquisition was started for the Cathars. That's what it started. It became what you were thinking was punishable. And we do have, of course, evidence even in the 20th century. We have certain German Nazis saying, I want to be the new Tertullian because I like the way he thought, and the way he thinks is how we can really control the flock.
Yeah, I think you're quite correct about another thing when we look back from the 21st century about how people behaved in this soup, and even beforehand, is it wasn't just that the religion wasn't specifically important as long as you were obeying the tax laws. We also have very little understanding of, well, they conceived of both race and nationality very differently. So you end up, if we try to think about, oh, these people are Libyans or these people are Romans, like, it didn't quite work like that. You would have birthplace, and all of these ideas were constructed differently, which makes it really challenging to, like, there isn't a Christendom where the Christians lived, and there isn't any of that kind of stuff. All the sort of identity pieces, as long as you were behaving yourself within the imperial construct, were very different. And slaves could be from, they could be any race, Romans could be any race, you could be whatever, and we don't really have it constructed that way. And it's
slaves became emperors in the Roman. Black people could become emperors in the Roman Empire. There was a meritocracy. It was your actions that defined you.
Yeah, and so in York, in the north of England, where we find African Roman soldiers buried up near Hadrian's Wall and so on, they were Romans. That was, and nevertheless, they were African migrants to Britain working for essentially the Italian government. And that's kind of how it looks now. And go, that's not how it was constructed.
That's not how they saw it. Yeah, in this day and age, they would have been judged by what they post on social media. It seems thought control has gone completely crazy. Who you vote for, or what you think, can be so punishable in this day and age. And again, there's a good case that this really started with the paranoia of Irenaeus and the Church Fathers.
I think it is a strong case. I think that building out of kind of thought crime. And it also largely explains, or could be one of the contributing factors, why so many of these ideas vanish from the historical record, but then show up 800 years later. Because when you start to enforce the thought crime with second century technology, it's imperfectly applied, but it kind of does the damage. And there's I think it's in one of the essay collections the Scarlet Imprint put out. I can't remember. It might not even be. It might be in Serpent Songs. But there's a case to be made that the Bogomil model influenced the Witches' Coven of essentially the Dark Ages and early Middle Ages, because it's the same idea about going out into the woods to participate in a ritual to a secret god, and the need for that. I mean, it's interesting to think of. I'm not sure if it happened, but the need to think of. We don't understand what that sort of thought crime thing worked. We're kind of familiar with, the various witch trials in Europe, but it was different. And the Bogomils and the Cathars sort of just start popping up centuries apart. And you think, where have you guys been for 600 years? How has this worked?
Yeah, you wonder about that. I mean, there's not a really historical stream. I mean, as Yano Quiliano pointed out, you have to look at the tree of gnosis, the tree of thought. These thoughts are jumping around, and people are realizing things and looking at past documents. Yeah, it's interesting. You talk about the Bogomians and the Cathars, where the world hating guys, they were 100% against churches or temples. They thought that defiled things. They wanted to go out either to meet in nature or to meet in somebody's hearth or something like that. That's where they thought they could really find an experience.
So it's that classic absence of evidence thing, but I find it fascinating that the sort of greatest flowering of this other god idea, right, is in ports along the sort of coast of at the bottom of the Pyrenees, there in between what we now call Spain and France. These ports were being used by the Phoenicians probably earlier, and by the Romans, and you have all this there are vectors that allow for ideas to go into hiding, like Yoda from the Empire. And I find it all, and it's the kind of thing that is attached to the Holy Grail myth. We'll probably never know, and in many ways that's good, but it's interesting to me that there are vectors that would allow the move of these ideas, and I find it very magical, particularly the sort of Cathars and that sort of piece. We just don't really know.
Right, yes. Yeah, I mean, in southern France, you had the Kabbalists coming out. In Spain, you had the Cathars, the Knights Templars, the Troubadours, all sort of rubbing shoulders and sharing ideas. I mean, where did they get this information? What was there? I personally feel not in my you might say historical studies, but my occult studies, I think that there's a lot of portals in the Mediterranean around that area. And somehow the Phoenicians and others were just very attracted to these sort of sources of power, these dimensional places. But again, that's not something I'd ever prove. But it is something I have experienced in places, not exactly I would say in Portugal. I've seen or I've experienced some of these portals. So it's no surprise that's where all the heretics would have ended up.
Well, I mean, I kind of mentioned that with I will retire to Cathar country if I can retire. When I first went, so first trip, the plane landed in Marseille, and we were driving down to Sète and further along from there. And I'm sort of driving along these coastal bits heading towards Spain in southern France. And you would believe that Mary Magdalene took her son after the death of her husband, Jesus, and fled here, which is a myth that obviously is very Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and given that these people, it's unlikely physically exist, it didn't happen, but you believe it. It just feels like it has that. It feels sacred, and it feels like secret sacred. And I'm in alignment with you that there is something particularly. There's a very Isaiah current in that kind of late classical sense there. And have you been to Barcelona? No, you haven't. There's
no, I haven't.
There's one of my favorite cathedrals in the world is Santa Maria de la Mar there, and it's a temple to Isis. So, like, you just walk in, and here is this Isis on the coast. It's the sort of like the church for the fishing families that were leaving the port, and it's astonishing. And you go, you can have a PKD hallucination back to like late period Alexandria. It's incredible. That's in that same sort of Cathar, Troubadour, Zohar, Moorish Spain axis, and there's something about that part of the world. And this is where magical thinking allows you to kind of bring in the non-human person influence on how these ideas move around.
No, I agree. I might have to visit you when you retire there. We gotta have some good magical rituals.
Yeah, exactly. Or just sit there drinking pastis in hats.
Listening to Leonard Cohen or something.
Yeah, basically. Actually, we got to go back. There was a question I wanted to ask, because this is pertinent to a question I've been asked the other week. Miguel, who was Paul? Did he exist? And was he a Gnostic?
That is a very good question. Again, we don't want we've got to change our thinking. First of all, Paul was part of the stream that was going on. He was definitely part of what was in the air, at least that esoteric air. He certainly uses a lot of the Gnostic terminology, like Sophia, archons, the powers and principalities, the initiated, so forth. He seems to be talking about a heavenly Christ and hypostasis of Yahweh, which, again, as I mentioned, he sees that Yahweh is just this unknown God that the Jews and Gentiles had never known. And he, through his hypostasis of Jesus, his angel, he's bringing this gnosis, this information down to those who have ears to hear and eyes to see. But that's one way to see it. That's what we can tell about his writings. And of course, the Gnostics really loved his writing. They really thought that the man had gnosis, and they built upon his ideas and a lot of his letters. Now, as this is not a new idea by far, because this is something that I think the 2nd century Ebionites contended, was that Paul was simply a cipher for Simon Magus, as the church fathers called him, the father of all heresies and the father of Gnosticism. And it's also very interesting because it was Tertullian who called Paul the apostle of the heretics. Paul was not embraced by the church at first, but then because of his popularity or the power of his ideas, they just had to appropriate him. But as the 2nd century, some of the 2nd century sects said, he really was Simon Magus. And this is something that modern scholars have noticed, that Paul is a cipher for this magician, Simon Magus, who was, in himself, a very, very interesting character. I mean, and in fact, this is something that's in the new book, Other Voices of Gnosticism, brought by Robert Price. There's a Jewish writing, 2nd or 3rd century, called the Toledo Jesu. And this is one of those, at first it seems like a polemic against Jesus, because in it you have Jesus and Judas having this magical battle in the air, which is very interesting because it just sort of parallels the magical battle that you find in the Pseudo-Clementines with Peter and Simon Magus, who are battling out in this magical duel. And of course, it was written that Simon Magus loses this duel. He falls and breaks his legs and dies. And there were definitely many stories about that. But in the Toledo Jesus, it actually says, black and white, it says, Paul's original name was Simon, and he was a magician. So this gets, you have to read the Other Voices of Gnosticism, but or listen to maybe Robert Price on Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. It's a very, very compelling case that these individuals were one and the same. And of course, Simon Magus, he's one of my, you might say, patrons. I think he's the guy I really look up to as far as magicians are. And I think I think his place in history is very underrated and very understated. I think, and other scholars have seen, he really was maybe the first person in Western history who wrote about how we really shared in pure essence with the gods. We shared the divine fire with the gods. There was no separation between human and gods. In fact, humans had 3 stages in this world. There was God in the seed, God in the becoming, and God in actuality. And every human being was at that stage. And again, he uses in his writings the divine fire, because he was very influenced, or his writings or his community was very influenced by Stoicism and the idea of this unchanging fire, this changing fire that I think it was Heraclian who wrote about. So I find Simon Magus very fascinating, and I think there's a good case that he really is Paul. Like I say, I would say jokingly, Paul is Simon Magus in drag.
Yeah, and what I find interesting, because I agree with you on the fact that he's underrated and needs to be elevated correctly in a sort of, Mead wrote about him more than 100 years ago, but he needs to return, especially if he is Paul, or Paul is a title, or a cipher for one or the other. Because in the magical battle between Simon and Peter, that's Rome versus the competitor, and obviously Rome gets to write the story because they're like Petros.
Even says, Peter. Yeah, Peter's arguing this is the way we do things, and Simon Magus bring you something completely new and unheard of, something that's really going to liberate every individual. I mean, it's a beautiful speech he does in the Clementines, and I think Simon Magus is hopefully making a comeback, especially with the work of you and me. For example, the exegesis of Philip K. Dick came out, a few years ago, and Eric Davis in my book talks about it, but there is one section, the section where Philip K. Dick is talking about Gnosticism, and even says, I'm too far into Gnosticism to back out. I wish it hadn't happened. He's taken the red pill and he's seen the world for what it is. And he ends this paragraph, Simon Magus lives.
Yeah,
I think Dick saw something, the spirit of it. And then even just as interesting, of course, in a parallel way, you got Carl Jung's Red Book that was published and that came out. And it's been found out in the book, he has Philemon, his sort of spirit guide that leads him to the underworld, to the depths of the collective unconscious. And Jung always said that all of his ideas came from this red book, all of his insights and everything else. It's like the font of all of Jung's magic, if you would. Now it's found out in one of the notes in the book, Jung actually said Philemon is a cipher for guess who? Simon Magus. So it was Simon Magus who guided Jung down and really made Jung into who he is. So hopefully Simon Magus is starting to appear in different places, hopefully in all of our lives.
Yeah, I think I'll confess something that's in my non-existent fourth book, that the reason I kind of wink at Simon Magus in Pieces of Eight is because he, and this kind of comes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning with horse races and soups and horse soup and so on. Since Cyprian allows, if you're east or west, to integrate and enrich, and then new and old world. And it allows integration and connection in a way that isn't appropriative. Simon Magus, especially if he's Paul, unlocks the combination of Gnostic and, where it is separate, Christian magic for Western occultists. You actually have your way in. He's a cipher, not just a cipher for Paul or vice versa, but he's a stand-in for that. In the kind of famous battle with St. Peter, he's literally laying out essentially Sethian ways of describing God, because, is he a dick because he put the fruit there, or is he not as powerful as a snake? Like, is this your creator God? And it's all there waiting to kind of
exactly. I mean, like you mentioned in our interview, like you mentioned in our interview, Gordon, he was the first person in history who stood up to the gods and said, F you, show me what you can do. The onus is on you. You guys need to do better, or we're going somewhere else. We're going to the stars. So I think that's very important. I think April DeConnick is going to argue in future that sort of wound that Simon Magus and the Gnostics gave to the gods, and of course in ancient time the god, the politics and everything else was an extension of the gods. I don't think society ever really healed from that. I mean, humanity had been fine for tens of thousands of years obeying the gods and the spirits, but Simon Magus gave that wound that seemed to have festered and would later come back. Again, we're talking about you and I are talking the medieval times in southern France, and then later with the Enlightenment and Voltaire and atheism. It almost seems like they made the cut and it never healed.
Yeah, I would agree. And I wonder where, as you say, there are some texts that are recently come to light, at least in terms of one text, at least in terms of Western scholarship. But I wonder if this idea wasn't floating around somewhere, because if not, there's a very interesting psychogeographic thing that I want to kind of put out there, which is St. Peter's is the basilica in Rome / the Vatican, right? And you have St. Paul's in London. So I like the idea that built on an old temple to Diana, just up from the Thames, is a basilica to, in London of all places, is a basilica to basically Simon Magus. That's amazing. And you kind of have this sort of London-Rome combination, and it's sitting right there. And these are the kind of things, if people kind of push on that door, you can psychogeographically explore and experience.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm sure there's more out there. I mean, I've always said that probably 20,000 years ago, as the tribe is going, they're worshiping the god, there was probably one guy in the back who said, "Oh my God, the gods must be crazy. When am I going to get hit by a Coke bottle? There's got to be something better than this reality." Just that there was probably a guy next to him saying, "You know what? I don't think the gods exist at all. There must be something else." But these two fellows probably never made it that far, were never heard. And of course, again, we start as oral societies start writing down these ideas they started coming to the surface. I mean, the Greeks I forget which philosopher is talking about atheism. And of course, I like to tell people, maybe the original Gnostic was the story of Prometheus. I mean, that's a story where you have this being that's neither man nor God, who's helping humanity wake up. Again, he brings fire from the gods. It goes right into the Simon Magus and the divine fire that each one of us has that really needs to explode to, as we talked about at the beginning of the interview, give meaning to this very, very cold universe.
Yeah,
Am I getting too poetic, Gordon?
No, it's lovely. I mean, it puts him in the shape. It puts him in the kind of classical. There is a way of getting out. He's the stand-in. He's the Lucifer. He's the Prometheus. He's the what have you. There is a way of getting out, and it required breaking the universe. It required a taboo violation in some way to get that knowledge to us. And I think that is amongst the oldest myths. I have actually written that I think it's 70,000 years old. And you have, so Simon Magus's shriek is 70,000 years old. Like I think that original violation, and it's to do with how humans realize they're different to the rest of the kind of natural world, and it's in there. It's the development of hunting technology, and it's daring the gods. It's like, I don't know, in Forrest Gump when the guy's up on the top of the mast shouting at the storms, "Bring it on!" That's I like that. I like you.
Or Truman screaming on the boat. Is that exactly the best you can do? And it's interesting because there's that terrible movie by Oliver Stone, Alexander, and where they're, I'm sure, I don't know if you've seen it, and they're all running around with Irish accents, except Alexander's mom, who has a Russian accent and all that. But there's that one scene where Philip takes Alexander down into the basement, into these catacombs, and he says, "I'm going to tell you the biggest secret of all." And young Alexander's like, "Whoa, what is it?" And he says, "We hate the gods. We only admit it when we know they're not listening." I thought that was brilliant, and many scholars have agreed that the ancients probably did not like the gods. But it was the Gnostics who actually were finally public about this thing, and again decide, okay, what are we going to do about it?
Well, what are we going to do about it, Miguel?
The only thing we can do is keep waking people up that they find their own divinity, their own path, and make their own damn decisions away from these power brokers, the secret deep state that has existed since the beginning of time, from the priest and the king and the senator and all that, and we figure it out ourselves. I mean, I can't think of anything else before we get crushed or retire to southern France.
Nice. Well, on that note, for people who want to do exactly that, where might they go to find out more? For people who, if this is even possible, haven't heard of you before, Miguel, where do they go to get more?
I'm sure there's a lot of those. Well, surprising nobody, they would have to go to thegodabovegod.com. And that's where I have all of my heresies, my choices away from the normal books. The podcast is there, Aeon Byte, and everything else. And they'll find, of course, a few of your wonderful interviews there. And, of course, we do discuss Simon Magus.
We do. And this will all be linked up in the show notes, as well as links to Miguel's Well, actually, both books. Which, by the way, on that note, thank you very much for your time. Congratulations on the new book. I found it as fascinating as the first one.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Always a pleasure.
Yes, indeed. There you go then. Heresy, Simon Magus, the Cathars, Competing Christianities, and Destroying the Universe by Waking Up. These are a few of my favourite things. For more information on topics such as these, subscribe to the Rune Soup and or Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio Heresies on iTunes, YouTube, or your favourite podcatcher. Leave a comment on the blog or the Rune Soup Facebook page, or find me on Twitter where I am Gordon, Gordon_White, WHITE. Until next time.